Welcome to the podcast, Phenomenosophy, Episode 5, Path to Freedom. Today, Gingy and I will be discussing the various principles and philosophies and practices that have been around through the ages, from the earliest philosophies and religions up to modern traditions and philosophies as well, regarding personal freedom and responsibility and some other things that we'll be getting into. So, Gingy, how are you doing today?
What's up? Doing pretty good. How about you?
I am very well. So, I think what I'd like to do is, have a conversation regarding, let's start off with, what do you think, and if somebody asks you about freedom, or when you think about personal freedom and your experience of freedom, what are some of the things that come to mind for you?
That's a good question. I guess I'd have to define what freedom is first.
Right.
So,
yeah, and actually,
I think,
many of the philosophies we'll be touching on today, I feel there's a lot of different phrases used. So let me throw out some of the phrases that I plucked from various traditions, philosophies, and religions in order to kind of like really, I feel like it's all part of the same conversation. So in Western religion, especially Christianity, you have a concept of the closest thing I can come to, or the closest concept that related to what we're talking about today that I felt, in my opinion, was that of salvation, and the power of arriving there through faith. So that's one principle and concept through religion. And then like you have the Hindu traditions where they have the concept of moksha, which is liberation. And then even concepts in Buddhism like nirvana or even satori or samsara, which I believe translations, you could translate it as liberation. You can translate it as enlightenment. There's many ways of translating this, but I feel like in many philosophical traditions that we can kind of tie them all together under the banner of freedom. So with that, go.
So the first thing I would say is that I notice often that people confuse freedom and liberty, especially in America.
Mm-hmm.
So I would start there in making a distinction where liberty is something that's granted and freedom is something that's inherent, because that to me is the context to look at the experience of freedom. Whether or not you are free and whether or not you experience freedom are two different things. And that's something that's inherent with being human on this planet.
So,
technical difficulties.
Yeah, get your gain going up a little bit. You're cutting out. Okay, so freedom, you want to make a distinction between freedom and liberty, is what I hear you saying.
Right.
And
so hold on, did that get any better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Well, we'll see. We'll see when you're not stretched over your computer. So the distinction that you were drawing was between
two distinctions actually.
And freedom.
The difference between liberty and freedom, and the difference between being free and experiencing freedom. So,
so what's the distinction there between being free and experiencing freedom?
Okay, so fundamentally, let me start with the other one. So the difference between liberty and freedom is liberty is something granted by an external authority, and freedom is something that is inherent within being human. So if we're looking at freedom and not liberty, then it's the difference between experiencing freedom and being free. You may be free to make whatever choices you want, but feel like you can't make certain choices without something. So you may feel that you're not totally free to do anything that you actually want to do.
Okay,
so like say say like I don't have the freedom, I don't feel like I have the freedom to go do crack cocaine and heroin anytime I want to because of the laws that are in place and XYZ, which realistically, I'm entirely free to go procure those things and do them. There's just ramifications afterwards. So the mental construct that I create around those, the relationship between those substances and our legal systems have me experiencing not being free.
Okay, lack of freedom. But that's really,
Right.
doesn't that speak to the distinction you were making about liberty? Because you were saying that liberty was something that was granted. So is it a liberty
No,
that you're
because
speaking into? Or
you're not.
Well, here's my confusion. Because
Okay,
you
go ahead.
said that there was a freedom inherent
Correct.
in being, right? So what do you mean by that? You said there's an
So-
inherent freedom. What do you mean by inherent freedom?
There was no external source that gave me the ability or the option to go procure and consume whatever I want and make up my own mind as to what it is I'm going to consume. Whereas the government has not given me the liberty to consume illegal substances, but I still have the freedom to go find them and do them if I want to.
Okay.
There's just ramifications for those acts, right? I could potentially owe tons of money or spend time in jail or, that kind of thing.
Okay. So that's distinct from
Right.
because you made a third distinction here of experience of freedom. So
Right.
you've talked about the inherent freedom of really I can choose. That's kind of really the inherent freedom that you're referring to is choice. I can choose to really do whatever I want. Right? I could make any choice that I want at any moment, and that's the inherent freedom we were talking about. And then you talk about a liberty, which is authority granted by something, someone, which allows for certain things to occur or allows you to partake in a certain activity or whatever. And now, tell me about the experience. You made a third distinction there, which was the experience of freedom.
So I don't think I really gave an explanation or an example of liberty, but maybe it could be something like, because I'm playing basketball, I'm afforded certain liberties. Like if I get some type of illegal contact, I get to shoot extra shots for free throw, right? Potentially get something in return for a foul or whatever. So that would be like a liberty that's granted to me by an external source. I can't say, hey, I'm taking free throw shots. That doesn't work in the game of basketball. The referee has to deem it appropriate for me to be rewarded with free throw. So now, after that, the experience of freedom versus actually being free are two totally different things. And I did give an example of that where I have freedom of choice, but I may not experience being free to choose anything I want. But they're not necessarily the same thing. So I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I did kind of give one. But
I thought your example of to me, it seemed like you were speaking about that when you were speaking about the drugs, right? Like there are laws
right.
that prohibit certain
because
drug
I
use.
believe that I could go to jail, I may not feel free to make that choice.
No, yeah,
which in reality,
but that's the laws that are in place. Yes, that's why I'm saying you had already made those two distinctions. Right. The inherent freedom that I can choose it at any time. Right. What I'm asking, okay. I felt like you hit those two. I didn't feel like you needed to go over.
I thought you were asking me to explain it again.
No, I wanted you to explain to me the third one, the one you haven't explained, which was experience of freedom. Because I feel you touched on inherent freedom, which is out of choice. I can choose whatever, whenever. And you touched on freedom, on liberty. So I feel like you've touched on those two. You made those distinctions, but you made a third distinction in experience of freedom, and that's what I wanted you to.
So the question would be, How do you experience freedom, or
what's the
experience
distinction?
freedom?
What's the distinction? You talked about an inherent freedom, you've talked about a liberty, and you talked about and the experience of freedom is the word you use.
Right. So I had a distinction of freedom versus liberty, and then I had an entirely different distinction of experiencing freedom and being free.
Okay, so
So the
explain that.
experience is different.
Okay, so
So-
tell me that distinction.
And that was the example I gave about the drugs. I'm totally free to do any drug I want to, but because of the potential ramifications that might happen, like jail, I don't feel and experience I'm free to actually participate in those things.
All right, I feel like there's a blurred distinction there because the going
Okay, let's clear it up.
Because the going to jail is that there's this authority.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So that would be like you're not at liberty.
Yeah.
To
me, that's a blurred distinction there. That's
so let's
not
get
clear.
a different.
I feel like there is a distinction. Like when you said the words, I was like, okay, I feel like I know where he's going with that. But that example, in my opinion, is shite and doesn't really get at what you're trying to say.
So let's think this through. Let's find an example of what that would really be like in an example where it's not referencing any type of authority figure, like police or government, jail, that kind of
Or
ramification.
laws, consequences,
Right.
whatever.
So something would have to be totally internal, which could be like I'm free to communicate or speak to anybody that I want to. But because I feel shy or because I've been criticized before, because whatever my previous experiences may be, I may feel like I can't do that. That's just not, who I am. That's just not something I'm good at. That's not something I enjoy. So the distinction for me is that there's things getting in the way of experiencing the freedom that's inherent within it, the individual.
Right. Perfect. Because that's really where every kind of other philosophy around that, what you're calling experience of freedom, jumps in. Yeah. So it's because it's that. So in Hindu traditions, they have the concept of liberation. What are you being liberated from? And then in Buddhism, same thing. They have this concept of samadhi or nirvana, the letting go, the blowing out. And if you look at the principles that are in place that would prevent one from that experience, I always like to, I feel like in this conversation that the simplest explanation as far as practical usable concepts and principles as well as practices that you can embody would come from Eastern traditions such as Buddhism, Taoism, and Zen. And so I'll start with that because the fundamental elements, the fundamental teachings, doctrines of Buddhism starts with what's called the Fourfold Noble Truth. And that first truth, which is really what I think you're getting at, is what holds you back, what's preventing that experience of freedom. And that first truth is dukkha, which is Sanskrit. And we translate as suffering, as the truth of suffering. And so you, in your example that you were just explaining, there was, well, what's holding me back? And it could be, what you feel will come in return, what you feel the experience will be. It's how we avoid, what you're talking about is avoidance, right? Avoiding suffering, avoiding whatever it is that would have you not in a place of not suffering.
Right. Being uncomfortable.
Being uncomfortable, whatever it is. So, I mean, suffering seems like a pretty extreme word.
But really, it doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to mean like
No.
at the end of a blade suffering.
Right. No. And that's where
It could just be uncomfortable.
exactly. And that's really, I want to paint a broad stroke with this concept of suffering,
Okay.
because it isn't intended to be like, I imagine, especially in the use of English, you say the word suffering, and the pictures and the images that conjure up in one's mind are like, someone being hung from their feet and, dipped in water
Tortured.
and tortured. And so it's suffering. It comes in many different forms. And I guess if you look at the other truths here, okay, it may give you an idea of really what we're talking about when we say suffering. So the second truth in Sanskrit is trishna. It's where we get our word thirst, right? And it's translated typically as attachment, right? And I think that definition.
What's the difference between that
lacking.
and desire?
It's exactly. It is.
Okay.
There is. It could be. It's translated both ways. In fact, some people do translate it as desire. But I think if you look at the root word, the Sanskrit word of thirst, I almost feel that's almost more to the point than attachment and desire.
Right.
And so if you look at, so it's desiring or thirsting or having attachment to that is the cause of suffering, right? So the second truth, Trishna, is the truth of the cause of suffering.
I can kind of see both of them there, where to thirst or have desire for something, like a new car or a specific food that you want to eat, there may be suffering involved in that, but that's easily let go of, and it's no longer something that I may be experiencing suffering with.
Right.
However, if I remain attached to that desire and that thirst, so there is an aspect of like being attached to the thirst.
Right. And also look at the thirst or the desire beyond material things. People thirst or desire to be right. People thirst or desire to be accepted, to be acknowledged, right? So this goes beyond just like an attachment to things. It goes beyond a desire for stuff. It is also the desire, or like you said, attachment, or the thirst for even a state, a state of mind, a feeling, an emotion, like
the desire to be happy all the time.
Right. And there's this, this people who just seek gratification. Right, they live life in just seeking gratification, and whatever gratification they seek and achieve is never enough, because there's always more seeking for gratification. So you could see in there that being the thirst, and having thirst is at the root or cause of suffering. So the third,
there is one more thing that pops into my mind, which is, was it Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Who hierarchy of needs guy? Did you ever read into that?
Sure. No.
I
may have, but it's not. Nothing's coming up for me right now.
I'm actually going to look it up real quick so I can tell you, because it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's basically like physiological needs, so like shelter, food, sleep, that kind of thing. There's a safety level, which is like enough money, enough resources, enough human connection, or not human connection, because that's the third level, which is like love and belonging. Then the top one, or the second to top one, is self-esteem and feeling good about yourself and self-image. And then the top one is self-actualization. And so they say that you can't create a level of safety without first achieving the physiological need and satisfying that, and then the safety, and then love and belonging, and then esteem, and then self-actualization.
Right. That's interesting, because remember, Buddhism comes out of Hinduism. Basically, Buddhism is eliminate all the dogma and culture of Hinduism, and you're stuck with these core principles that the Buddha kind of carved out of the principles of Hinduism. And in Hinduism, moksha, which is liberation from ignorance, self-realization, self-actualization, self-knowledge, they describe the liberation from samsara, which is like cyclical life, the cyclical world. Oftentimes people define it as the cycles of birth, or Hindus would describe it as the cycles of birth and death. But I feel like it's talking about like the rat race as well, the cycles within a life, cyclic world in itself. And just as you were describing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they have, again, the Hindu approach is a little more complicated than the Buddhist approach. And that's why I kind of was going with the Buddhist, because it's much simpler. But it's interesting because in the Hindu approach, you have many of those elements that you were describing in Maslow's hierarchy within the liberation, the process of liberating oneself from samsara. And so you have those, for one, those different aspects of life. You know, there's the three paths of dharma, the virtuous, the proper, the moral life, artha, which is the material prosperity, income security, means, and then kama, which is pleasure, sensuality, or emotional fulfillment. So it's interesting that again, these aren't, Maslow isn't proposing anything new. These are ancient ideas formed in ancient traditions.
That's why you put them in a pyramid. But it is interesting in concept of the desire, the attachment, the need is what is at the seat, the root of suffering, because there's an entire ideology that is founded on this hierarchy of needs, where fundamentally people need air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, and the reproduction. That's like at the baseline of the human experience. And you can't reach safety of needs like personal security, employment, resources, health, property until you've satisfied the bottom level. And it goes up and up and up to self-actualization. And in my mind, like that can't even be the top. What happens when you're self-actualized? I almost imagine that there would be an entire spectrum of needs that grow from that, of being self-actualized. But I wonder if even engaging in this model inherently creates suffering, having a model based on needs.
Yes, I would say probably most likely. If we got into the conversation of, like, let's say samadhi, and this is for another show, definitely, because this is a much deeper topic than we can address as a subtopic here. But the illusion of the self, okay, is the first thing you're going to approach when you start looking at some of these traditions of liberation and freedom, in that without taking on and comprehending and understanding and having a concept of self that goes beyond the illusion of self. Like I said, this is definitely a topic I don't want to get into right now. I feel like we can do a whole show on that. But I would say yes, because for one, it's you're defining needs, right? So let's look at let's go back to our fourfold noble truth here and finish it out real quick. Just so that
number 3.
Yes, the third. So we got the truth of the truth of suffering, right? The truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the second truth. And the third truth is the the Eightfold Noble Path. And it's funny because in Western culture, in Western society, we equate this typically as being the same thing as or similar to like the 10 Commandments, but they're not that. It's not.
There's 4 truths.
This third truth. The third truth is the Eightfold Noble Path, or is it the fourth? Maybe Nirvana is the third. Either way, I might be mixing them up, but I don't think the order of them is really necessary. I feel like we can go on to the Eightfold Noble Path here, and it's not like Western tradition where it's like, here's what you must do. I equate at least fundamentals of Buddhism to like an early form of like psychoanalysis, okay? In that when you look at it, or at least its core elements, of course, it's been made into religion in many different cultures, and it's actually at the base of many different religions within many different cultures. But I'm coring out these central principles, which is just that Fourfold Noble Truth and the Eightfold Noble Path within the Fourfold Noble Truth. And it's not like commandments. It first of all, again, if I go back to the Sanskrit, the reason I like to use the Sanskrit words in explaining these principles is that we can also look at how it may be translated. If I was just to read somebody's English translation of it, I feel like something gets lost. So in the Eightfold Noble Path, it begins each of the, I guess, elements of the path, each of the 8, begins with the word samyank, okay, which is typically translated as right, okay? And typically when somebody sees right, they think of it as opposed to wrong, okay? So you have like samyak, right view, right aspiration or intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, like career, right effort. And then again, there's typically the translation of right mindfulness, which we could also, in the work that you and I do, we've used the word presence.
Do you
and
spell
then there's
right the same way?
Yes, samyank. It's not the word right. I'm going to give you the other translations. Okay. I'm giving you how these 8 elements are typically translated in English. And then there's the 8th, which is samadhi, which is typically translated as right concentration, which when you look at samadhi, because samadhi is not just a concept within Buddhism, but you find it in Hinduism and Jainism as well. And I feel like that's a really inadequate explanation, right concentration. So again, if we look at the word samyank, it could mean right, it could mean whole or holy, it could mean clearly, it could mean distinctly, it could mean balanced, it could mean conscious. Okay, so those are some of the words we could use there. So again, rather than looking at as right as distinct from wrong, right, wrong, or correct. I've actually heard it translated as correct view, correct intention, correct speech, correct action. Right. It's not what it meant. It's not saying like, oh, there is a right way and there's a wrong way. You better do the right way. For one, it's not saying you better do anything. It's like, look, there's suffering. That's fundamental truth. There is suffering. Number 2, the cause of suffering is your attachments. It's your thirst, your desires, right? Mm-hmm. And then the third truth is like, oh, look, here's a way to suffer less or to get out of the whole suffering game, right? And it's these 8 practices, okay? It's really what it is. So if we look at it as like whole or balanced view, or whole or balanced intention, or whole or balanced speech, or action, or livelihood, or effort or mindfulness, you can start to see that there's more meaning that we can bring in there, and not so much there is a right and a wrong way. There's a right way to view things. You know what I mean? That's why I feel like that translation of right, as if there's as opposed to oh, well, that's the wrong way to look at it. This is the right way to look at it. This is the wrong way to look at it. Or
this is the right way to live.
Yeah.
These exactly. Are the 10 commandments you should follow.
Exactly. That's not what that word is meant. That's not what they mean by that word. It's not. They're not saying. If it were, they would say, think this way, right? That's what would be coming out. If there was a right way to speak, right, then they would say, oh, speak like this, speak this way, say these things. If there was a right way to act, they would say, well, act this way, act. You know what I mean? But when you start to think about, okay, well, what about balanced? What if I substituted that word right for balanced or whole, right? It starts to take on a different meaning. And what's interesting is in later analysis of Buddhism, it was typically looked at as one who is within the practices and embodying the practices and principle of Buddhism is one who walks the middle way. Okay, and there's even a word, I'm forgetting it right now, but it's basically a middle wayness, right? And so it's in the middle wayness, and this comes out of the Chinese interpretations of Buddhism, which led to Chan, which became Zen. And the reason why there's this different interpretation of the Chinese traditions is because Chinese already had Confucianism and Taoism. And so there was already, with Taoism, there was already this very balanced way of looking at the nature of reality, in that the way, right, the Tao, was about that balance and that essential integration of opposites. That you don't have one without the other. You don't have light without dark. You don't have good without evil. You don't have these things. These things define each other. You cannot have one without the other. And so there, with that background, that both that Taoist and that Confucius background, or Confucianism background, I guess, that samyang has a different meaning, right? It's not so much right. The right view or the right way to speak or the right way to act, as opposed to wrong. It's more of a balanced or a holistic way of speaking or viewing or acting, right?
So it's a sacred way, which I really like looking at it in terms of sacred or conscious or spiritual or something like that, where it's not, it must be this way, but it is a way that could be intentional, it could be conscious, it could be sacred, it could be, if you choose to make it such.
Right. And I would say I think that's where what you have to look at is doing an analysis of your actions and your interpretations in such a way that you are conscious and aware of attachments, desires, like the practice of looking at whether or not what I'm saying right now is because I need to be right about something, or I need to look good. Because the need to be right, which is, and these are the reason I pick those two particular, because in Western culture, those are huge. That in Western culture, there is this need within people to be right, to look good, and the need for acknowledgement, right, and the need for approval, right? We seek the approval of others. So if we see that and we recognize that there is a desire for those things, right? There's the desire for looking good. There's the desire for being right. There's the desire for the approval, acceptance, and acknowledgement of others. And that desire is what causes the suffering. So in this path, where we're leading to, the fourth truth here is that nirvana. And nirvana, interestingly, literally translated as like blowing out, right? So it's the letting go. And I mean, again, it's not necessarily translated that way. Again, if you look at an English translation of Buddhism and the fourfold noble truth, and nirvana is usually going to be translated something like enlightenment or something along those lines. I don't think that that's what it is. It makes more sense that it's a letting go or a state of freedom, or moksha, like what the Hindus call it, that state of liberation. And so I would equate it to that, is that it's this state where if you, and again, it's not saying that by following this Eightfold Noble Path is necessarily equals this experience. It's like, look, if you want to get there, these are some practices you can undertake to get you there. So it's not a formula, so to speak, and that's why it's not even
the only way to get there.
No, and it doesn't say that it's the only way to get there. It's like, look, here's a suggestion. Like I said, it's like psychoanalysis, where it's like, well, okay, you're suffering, and we've got some practices, some tools. So like, if you take and break down each one, like, like the right view, right, or the balanced or holistic view. It's the way you view the world. So it's the way you're interpreting what's happening around you, which I feel like if you go back to the last episodes we did, especially Beyond the Matrix, yes, Beyond the Matrix especially, where we spoke into specifically, how worldview and ideologies and the narratives that we live our life by but really affects our experience of the world around us, right? So
yeah, I would go as far as to say that it governs how the world shows up for us and how we engage with it.
Right. So if we look at that one part of the path, right? So again, we're moving towards that state of freedom. We're moving towards that state of liberation. The first thing is my view, right? So it's not like, oh, well, if you're suffering, if you're desiring, it's because you ain't looking at things right. Okay. So again, not to make it a right or wrong conversation, but let's take some of those other words that we can replace samyak for. And what about a holistic or a balanced way of looking? What does that mean? What could that mean? A balanced way of viewing the world.
My first assumption goes to, I guess, being aware of both what my interpretation is and the facts of the events. Like what has actually happened and what I've created based off of what's happened. And in that way, I can balance and navigate, in partnership with reality.
And you can be mindful, present to suffering and desire. If you could just be present to there's a desire behind that, then you can have knowledge and know, well, that leads to suffering. At some point, because of this desire, and I would actually, I want to throw another word in there, expectation. When I've done coaching with people, that's one of the things I always bring up in every coaching session is like, look, with almost everyone, because everyone's got expectations of someone. And inevitably, their expectations of someone lead to disappointment. And I said, well, that's all you get. If you're going to have expectations, expect nothing but disappointment. Because you're in that space. That's part of the desire, right? So expectation.
And you actually can't have disappointment without expectation.
I mean, they go together. It's the Tao.
Exactly.
So yes, and I mean, there may be more to that conversation of disappointment. I don't want to get too deep. There are many rabbit holes that may come along during this conversation. I don't want to dive down every single one, but yeah, there may be a deeper conversation with disappointment. But right now, let's assume, expectation, disappointment are back and front for each other. They're left and right for each other.
They're inside and outside.
They're inside and outside. They go together. And then, okay, so there we go. Right view, or holistic view, or a balanced view. Right. So it takes a presence of mind, which is down on the list of these 8 steps. That presence of mind, right, which they call right mindfulness, right, in English, which could be looked at as a balanced presence or a holistic presence, like being present to the mind. That your interpretation of the world around you is happening through worldview, through narratives, through ideologies. And if you can get outside of that and be present to that, well, then you can start to balance the way you look at the world, and the way you view the world. And then next in the line is your intention, right? I find it interesting, even in the order that they present these in. It starts with your view. So the way you're looking at the world, right? And then next is typically translated one of 2 ways, either intention or aspiration. And if it's a balanced aspiration or balanced intention or a holistic intention that comes from a balanced view, right? Because really you need that balanced view in order to get clear, which is interesting. That's another translation of samyak, is clear, right? Clearly, right? So clear intention. And what might clear intention be? Well, clear intention might be intention that isn't in some way anchored by some desire, right? The desire to be right, the desire to look good, the desire to have approval or acceptance, right? So if we can clear all those things away with our view, right? We get to that
powerful,
point of clear
man.
view.
Imagine making or having the intentions that lead to the decision-making process, that lead to whatever life experiences and goals and things that people are going after. Imagine being clear on what the motive was behind the intent, whether it was to win this battle or to be right or to
and even
not
in that,
be embarrassed.
And even in that, right. I'm always going down in layers with people. Like I said, like in individual coaching, like my intention, my purpose was to win the battle. And well, as a coach, I would say, okay, well, why win the battle? Because there is something underneath that, and you keep going, you keep going, you keep going, you dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and eventually you get to, the desire for approval, the desire for acceptance, the desire for looking good, being right. There's really a handful of things that you can almost dig down under every single intention, because and I'm not saying that these people are being malevolent or deliberately deceitful about their intentions. I believe at a surface level, they believe that the intention was for that, because they really haven't examined that surface level reasoning and what's
realistically. I would say the majority of people are just operating automatically. How many arguments have been spawned and fought on social media or in person even, that people are like, yeah, I don't know why I got so fired up or anything, because they're defending some aspect that they're completely unaware exists for them. And this is a way, what we're talking about is being mindful of the operations inside the thought process.
Right.
Like, am I really wanting to win this fight or this argument or whatever with somebody because of an intention I've created purposefully? Or am I automatically trying to be right or to look good or something like that? Those two are huge, by the way. I see those in almost every single person I coach.
Absolutely. And so, okay, so now we've only made it through. These are just 2 of the truths. Look at how powerful just those 2 are, not truths, but the path, right? The first 2 steps in this 8-fold noble path. And I mean, powerful. Like that's why this conversation, I feel that, I'm not a Buddhist. I don't see myself as a participant of or subscriber of any organized religion. However, I do love this part of Buddhism. The Fourfold Noble Truth and the Eightfold Noble Path, I believe, are such powerful elements. And like I said, I feel like they're at the foundation of even like, if you look at like modern psychoanalysis or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that, like it's pretty difficult to actually separate some of these principles and practices of these ancient traditions from what modern science is using. And like you even have these secular movements in these spiritual traditions, like the entire secular world taking on meditation. Well, it does so many great things for my body. And you know what I mean? Like those were religious practices. Those were religious traditions. And now the secular world is adopting it. Like they have mindfulness trainings that have nothing to do with anything spiritual whatsoever. But clearly there is power and benefit to presence of mind, right? So
like there's literally trainings on how meditation can make you a better CEO.
Yeah, exactly. And what is meditation a new thing? No, it's ancient. It's a very ancient spiritual practice. And so I see a tremendous amount of value in these particular practices.
I agree.
Okay, so step 3 on the Eightfold Noble Path is, again, translated typically as right speech, but could also mean balanced speech, could mean clear or distinct speech. Right. Okay, remember all those definitions I gave you, all those ways we could translate samyak. And I already said balanced, holistic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So
that sounds like NLP, neuro linguistic programming,
doesn't it?
Be present to your words.
And actually, even some of the work of, and I'm not going to say this is a direct relation. I directly relate it to because I've done work around like John Searle's work on effective communication and speech acts and things like that. I'm like, this is an outgrowth of this principle. And I feel that those are extremely powerful principles and practices and concepts, at least the way I've applied them in business consulting and things like that, like the speech acts and effective communication is profoundly powerful. And here we are, step 3 in limiting that suffering, right? Getting away from that desire and that thirst brings you from the way you view to intention and aspiration to now speaking, right? And speaking in a clear, distinct, balanced, holistic, right way.
Intentional, conscious way. That's the thing that I see the most is a lot of times language is just thrown around with what they think it means. And as soon as I started looking up definitions for what things mean, I had to readjust my entire vocabulary. I mean, even still, I was like, oh, that's just rhetorical. My girlfriend was like, what does that mean? And I was like, oh, shit. I have to go actually Google that. Because I keep catching things like that I've been using my entire life and never actually looked at the definition.
Right.
So to me, it's huge in being present and aware to the word choice. Like it's one of the first things you learn in any like transformational center. Is they're like, oh, I get to versus I have to.
Right. Because that's the personal development work.
Right.
Yeah, it's there, and but that's NLP. That's you mentioned that with NLP. But yes, it's definitely present in a lot of personal development, professional development, even in philosophy, like of John Searle and whatnot. It's even though again, I don't think he would directly tie it to any of those. He was just like creating action from speech, which is interesting because that's where we're going next. So
number 4.
Number 4, what naturally comes out of speech, but action. So typically translated as right action, but it could also be translated as balanced action or holistic action or distinct or clear action. So in action.
That's like they say, all the old yogis I used to listen to were like, when you're walking, walk. When you're running, run. When you're sitting, sit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's actually, I know I'm going to mutilate this, and but I believe it's a Buddhist saying, before enlightenment, gather water. Shoot, what is it? Gather water and do something like mundane tasks, right? Like gather water and cook dinner. You know, that's not what it is. I'm totally messing it up right now, but it's a mundane task. The point is, before enlightenment, you do the mundane task. After enlightenment, you do the mundane task. It's just, it's like nothing really changes. You know, it's not that you do the mundane task 3 inches off the ground or anything like that. It's you still engage with life, and you still
It makes me
engage.
wish I was a cartoonist so I could draw up like before and after enlightenment series.
Right. Yeah.
Like dude going through his day and doing the exact same thing going through his day.
And that's the point of that particular saying, is that it's not that it doesn't really change. What changes, you don't see on the surface of one's day-to-day actions. It's in their personal experience of the world. That's really that's where all the changes happen, right? So he may not be experiencing, you know, the enlightened one who's still fetching water. Oh, that's what it is. Fetching water and something else. He's still fetching water and whatever other mundane task he's doing.
Doing the dishes.
But his experience is different. Oh, there is actually one about clean the bowl, wash the bowl. There's many sayings about enlightenment and the mundane tasks, and some may even be koans and whatnot. But it's interesting because, again, if we look at our procession so far, this process that we've gone through. Now here we find ourselves at action, and it's like, well, had you not started with view, gotten clear on the view, the intention, and the words, the speech, could you have this balanced action? You know, so it feels like a progression, right? That
it does.
You start with like my views, right? Like how I'm interpreting the world, which is, you know, like you said, it's like you can't separate it from that worldview and the narratives and the ideologies that you've adopted knowingly and unknowingly. But without getting a clear view of that and being able to shift the narratives and shift the worldview such that you're now viewing from a balanced, unbiased, clear, you know, however you want to translate that, samyang.
I really like.
How do you get to?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Intentional, yeah, and it can. I believe that is one of the ways you could translate it. It just wouldn't make sense with number 3 because then you'd have intentional intention. but that's often sometimes translated as aspirations. You could have intentional aspiration, but I don't know about intentional intention. Right?
You could,
tautology.
Because like if I'm not intentional with my intent, and I'll kind of separate the words that way, then my intent may be to be right, like we were talking about, automatically, unintentionally. Right. That's what I was like, okay, if you're really being intentional with what you're intending.
Right. Well, actually, I think that's a conversation for another day as well, because in the work that I've done, I've always made a distinction of the concept of integrity. And that's how you distinguish integrity. If you think, if this is your intention, and if your intention and your actions and your results do not line up, that's where you have a failure in integrity. So livelihood I look at as like, okay, this is the day-to-day application of the other 4, right? Livelihood is practice, right? It's habitual now. So it's taking these principles from single circumstances, single events, right? Because the way you're thinking can be for any one set of circumstances and conditions can be seen as an event. Any speech or any specific or individual intention that you may have, we can separate as a specific event. This is now the embodiment. It's like taking these, the action, the speech, the intention, and the view, and incorporating it in a habitual way, in a day-to-day process. So, and again,
so making it embodied, making it a habit,
yes,
making it just the automatic process.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think you can make it an automatic process as we move down the line here, because there's nothing automatic about it. It's like you said. You could replace that samyak with intentional, right? There's nothing.
Right.
You can't be automatic and intentional, right?
That takes a practice. That takes dedication and consistency.
Right.
I see what you mean.
Okay. So that's how I see that one. It's about integration, embodiment of the principles, and then the next one is effort. So we could look at it again, typically translated as right effort, but you could look at it as a balanced effort, as a holistic effort, as an intentional effort, as clear or distinct effort. So effort, this is an interesting concept because it's so up until now, view and intention and speech, right? These are very much, personal, right? And can be seen as active. I don't know if that's really the word I'm looking at, or proactive. And then we moved into action and livelihood. This effort one, it's like the precursor to action, right? Effort is the precursor to the effort must be there before there is the speech, before there is the intention, before there is the action, before there is livelihood. Effort speaks to something else, more intangible kind of principle.
So what is the difference between action and effort? Because when I think about effort, I think I'm putting in the effort to
effort is
take an act.
Effort is behind action. Meaning action is the whatever act you consider connecting, right? So effort is like I said, like a precursor. It's there before there is action. It's there before there is speech, right?
Is it
for
instance, motivation?
No.
Okay.
No, because motivation can speak to something external. Okay. Like somebody whipping you with a bullwhip may motivate you to do something and take some action, right? But it's not. That's not what effort is. So effort is, again, now let's look at in the way that it's presented here as a balanced effort. So and what would an unbalanced effort look like? Like exertion beyond what is reasonable, or not enough exertion to achieve the action or to effectuate the action
I think about like a car that's the right two wheels drive and the left two don't. You'd end up kind of like running in circles.
Right. So this balanced effort is I guess you could look at it as, it's funny because we also have, I find a relationship here with that and intention or aspiration, right? So there's a similar quality to this one with the second one, which is inspiration or aspiration. So effort is like that. It's more etheric, less tangible. But also I'd say that the focus on this one, if we're going to use the English word of effort, would be that of balanced effort, right? Of not forcing, right? A balanced effort would be not be forcing something, right? If you're forcing something, clearly there's attachment or a desire, right? That may be behind the forcing of
like
something.
You're giving enough, you're not giving too much or too little. It's just a balanced effort.
Right.
Like a lot of people will think, well, if I work harder, I'm feeling tired, if I just push through these walls that I have for myself, then I'll be more productive. And people have found that if you stop and take a 30-minute break or get the sleep that, 8 hours of sleep in a night, then you'll actually get more done in less time when you come back to work. So it's kind of, I can see it in that type of way, the effort that you're putting into the act of working.
Right.
If it's balanced and it's not too much, too little, distracted, if you're like right in it, you can be incredibly productive.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, okay, so where are we at? Okay, so now it gets interesting. So we've done livelihood, effort, and now comes mindfulness. Okay. So typically translated as right mindfulness. And again, if we look at the many ways we could translate samyak, it could be, and even how you and I may use the word mindfulness. I know that's actually a word that has been so overused in the last couple decades that it's a word that most people are actually familiar with. Whereas 20 years ago, the word mindfulness didn't have much meaning. I feel nowadays that it definitely carries meaning for most people, at least in
I
Western.
think for a lot of people. And how would you define mindfulness? Because I feel like it's something that's typically I can be easily confused with presence or awareness.
Well, that's actually I actually use that to simplify it for people. I usually use presence of mind, and being present to is I equate to mindfulness, because mindfulness kind of has this. I would say because of how in the Western world how we look at the mind. Now, mindfulness is out of using that same phraseology in Eastern traditions doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. And it, like what we in the West think of as mind, most of the time is thought of as brain, is thought of as thinking. So it may not be a good word, because in this context, it comes out of the East, where the mind in the Eastern culture is located here. Can you even see that?
Yeah, right in the chest.
Right? Yeah. This is mind. We place the mind here, and so there's a headiness to mindfulness in Western interpretations of that. So presence kind of takes it out of the braininess of it. And so for me, I feel like it gets more to the point that I'm going to try to make with a Western audience, in that it's not really about thinking, right? As opposed to, like some of the work we've done around presence, right? Is about taking a step out of your active interpretation of the events around you. So it's like being outside of interpretation, in that you can see the interpretation happening. And this was why transcendental meditation and mindful meditation and things like that have become such powerful practices, because that's what you're doing, is you're breathing deeply, closing the eyes, and separating yourself from your senses. The senses are still at work, meaning there are still smells in the air, there are still sounds, there's even taste in your mouth, and there's even tactile feeling around your body, but you're in that practice, right, of meditation, you're separating yourself from being embedded in the interpretation of those senses, from being just the processor of those senses. You've separated, and you kind of just watch the senses happen. You watch thoughts happen. You get outside of them, right? So that's the presence to that. Those senses are occurring, but you're not caught up in the interpretation of the senses, meaning sounds are occurring, but you can observe them just as sounds rather than giving those sounds meaning, which is what you would typically do if you weren't in a state of mindfulness or state of presence. You hear a sound and you automatically think, oh, car alarm. Somebody's trying to break into a car, or somebody accidentally just ran into a car, or whatever. You're caught up in the interpretation of that sound.
The interpretation, the identification,
right,
meaning,
right.
What, like, is someone trying to get in my house? Is someone trying, someone driving a car? There's all of what we write after. It reminds me of that that meditation we did of Alan Watts's on Spotify. It's like 16 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. Where
the one with the music?
He guided us through listening to the outside world, the birds, as if it's just one big orchestra. Yeah, it's called Listen.
Listen. Listen.
And then he switched to listening to the thoughts and listening to the feelings and everything else internally, and then letting the wall between the two kind of blur and vanish as if it's just one happening.
Mm. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. And again, that's that level of mindfulness or presence allows you to really allows you to embody these, up until now, these previous 6 principles in a way that you can effectively have power with each of them, meaning like the view, right? The balanced view. You, in that state where of presence, you can distinguish the ideologies, the narratives, your worldview that are all affecting your interpretation of events around you. So it's an important part. It's very significant to be able to be in that state of presence for any of these really to work. Because otherwise you're caught up in the English translation of it, of right? Oh, well, you're not speaking right. Okay. And that's typically how in the West we have, within our traditions, we have a certain sets of ethics, moralities, things like that we have a judgment of, well, this is the right way and this is the wrong way. And we kind of just break things down that way. It's part of our worldview.
Which really is
difficult to separate ourselves from it.
It's really collapsed from, this is the good way, this is the bad way to do
it. It's one and the same. You know what I mean? Right way, yeah, right way, wrong way, good way, bad way. What I'm saying is, this isn't about distinguishing it that way. That's not what these are. What I'm saying is, without this state, without this presence, especially being brought up in the Western world, your tendency will be to have that right, wrong, good, bad way of interpreting these principles, right? Yeah. Well, you will look at it as, well, that this is the right way to view things. This is the right way to speak, and this is the right way to act. And this, So this mindfulness, this presence, allows us to transcend that translation of this word, this Sanskrit word of samyak, that is typically translated as right. We can translate it as keep it down. Okay. He wants to turn on the TV in the room. I'm like, all right, yeah, it's cool. Just keep down the volume. So
they translated as what?
The samyak without this practice, without this presence of mind, the translation of samyak, the way it's translated in the Western world as right, you could not elevate it or transcend that right, wrong, good, bad way of seeing these steps in the path, right? These 8 steps in the path. You would that's the only way you could distinguish it without kind of getting outside of that automatic interpretation that you're in without being present or mindful. So it's a necessary element. And once you're in that state of presence or mindfulness, this word, this samyak, can elevate to balanced, or could elevate to whole or holistic or conscious, or what you said, intentional or distinct or clear. It can elevate because now it's not about a dichotomy. It's not about this versus this, which is how we typically would distinguish something like this, especially something out of a tradition, because that's how we see our own traditions, right? The 10 Commandments were you do this. You do this, you don't do this. You do this, you don't do this, right? That's how it is. It's like this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad, right? But that's not what these are. These aren't moralities, right? These are practices for alleviating suffering, for elevating oneself, for transcending suffering.
It reminds me of a coaching call that I had last week, actually, where after all of the conversation and all the stuff that we had been talking about, she's like, this is amazing. This stuff is incredibly powerful. But why?
Why what?
She's like, why is it important? I'm like, not necessarily saying that working on things like your speech and how you view the world and your intentions, your declarations, all that stuff is important. But it's kind of clear to me now that really the question was like, how do I use this? What's the point of understanding these types of mechanisms and utilizing them? Because I think really where the thought process was coming from is, how will this change the thing that I'm working against?
Right. And I would say,
how does it change my job? How does it change my boss? How does it change
and I would
whatever?
say the very simple answer to that question is twofold: to transcend suffering and to experience freedom.
Yeah. And
you don't have
where
to.
I'm noticing now
and that's even the nature of this tradition, of these teachings. This particular doctrine, it's not saying you have to do shit. It's not like,
it doesn't say don't suffer.
Exactly. It doesn't say you must suffer. It doesn't say you must not suffer. It's like, look, people suffer. That's number one truth.
It doesn't even
people
say
suffer.
you will suffer.
No, it's just saying, hey, people suffer. And there's a cause to the suffering. And here's a process you can go through to limit it. But it's not saying you have to follow this process. It's not saying you have to limit suffering. So again, in the Western world, typically this Eightfold Noble Path is translated like the 10 Commandments. Like, oh, well,
right.
I got to follow this. I got to do these things. Check, check, check. Otherwise, I'm not going to get to Buddhist heaven, which I guess is...
Because really, like, the way that I ended up engaging with that question ended up being like, well, do you want to suffer through it? I didn't say it in those words. It was more like, well, what type of experience do you want to have while engaging with your work and your boss and whatever else, the things that are in your life, the things that you love so much, or the things that you hate so much.
Mm-hmm.
What type of experience do you want to have? And then I think it kind of clicked where she's like, oh yeah, so I guess that's the power of this. I can, create experience,
Right.
or shape or mold experience. And number one, I don't think many people see that as an option. It's just,
Right.
this is my experience and that's the way that it is. Or really understand that it's malleable, it's beneficial, it's something that if you really want to engage with, is incredibly powerful. Like changing, even after a certain aspect of that coaching session was about a process of healing. Everyone talks about, we need to heal the racial divide. We need to heal these traumatic events. We need to heal X, Y, and Z. And I was talking with her about, well, okay, give me something that you've healed. She gave me an event. I said, awesome. So did the event change? Nope. Okay, so then what changed? Like, well, I don't know. I'm like, did your relationship to the event change? Did the way that you describe the event, is the way that the event impacts you today, did any of that change? It's like, actually, all of that. The way that I hold that event, my relationship to the event, my experience of the event, everything has changed for me except for the event itself.
Right. And I would say that's
the power.
And that's the perfect demonstration of this process as we've described it.
Yeah.
Because really it's like you could break it down as a make yourself out to be some kind of Zen master and say, well, it comes down to your right view, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's really, that's what shifted, was her interpretation of events, right? That's step one. So, she's already dramatically affected her suffering around an event by step one, right? Step one, right view, right?
She didn't even know that's what was going on.
Right. But that is it. And that's why I feel this is just such a simple, it's so simple. And it's why I like it so much. This particular set of principles, the Fourfold Noble Truth and the Eightfold Noble Path. It's just simple, easy to remember. And really, if you remember the first three, you're good.
Really, if you chose to just work on one of these at a time,
yeah, you're good. Like view, intention, speech, you got it. Like work on that. When you got that mastered and wired, then you can look at the rest. So it's not even hard to remember.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, the eighth. Now this is interesting because I feel like the concept of samadhi could probably be a series, but we could definitely dedicate an entire show to it. But I feel like it's so poorly translated from the Sanskrit to English, in that it's translated as right concentration. And I don't.
That's the last one?
Yeah, I don't think that cuts it at all. For one, let's look at the principle of samadhi. And again, this is something that is present in many Eastern traditions, but specifically Hinduism, Jainism, made its way east into Buddha, Central Asia Buddhism, as well as Far East Buddhism, and is really still present, at least as a principle or concept, even within Far Eastern forms of Buddhism like Chan or Zen. It's rather than looking at it as right concentration. So let's look at all the things we've talked about so far.
Let's look at concentration.
Well, no, because I feel like it's a really shitty translation. I think let's get rid of concentration. Let's take it off the table, because it's
scrap that.
Yeah, scrap it. It's a very poor
Let's think this
translation.
through.
Yeah. So take it off the table completely. We're going to replace it completely. So if we look at all the concepts that we've gone through so far, the first 7 steps here of the Eightfold Noble Path, especially view, intention, and mindfulness. Well, I think I want to say taking those 3, we can maybe create a model. No, let's just go for it. Okay, so samadhi it's like being in a state of that presence, right, that we talked about in the last step, that presence, that mindfulness, where not only where you are clear of the illusion of the self. Okay, so God, I really didn't even want to bring this in.
Let me ask a question real quick. So concentration, could it be like focus?
Gingy? No. Get concentration out of it. That's why I want you to get it out of here, because you're going to think of shit like focus. No.
All right.
Take it off the table. Get it out of here. It's a very crappy translation. Don't make excuses for these people.
All right,
I'm trying to justify them. Okay, so remember I brought up the concept of illusion of self. So let's say if we take the concept of this mindfulness, this presence, where you actually can see that all that experience, the sensual experience, the experiences of all the senses, as well as thoughts that run through the mind and everything else, that all of that is illusory. It is not you. And it is not, or I should say, it's not the essence of you. And by being able to be outside of it, okay, that being outside of it and being free of the illusion of the self, or in Western philosophy, being free of the ego, that is samadhi. Okay, so it's not about concentration. Concentration puts you into the ego. So it'd be like it's a state of being free of the ego. Okay,
so it's like maintaining the difference, so that doesn't collapse as if it's the same.
Maintaining the difference.
I'm grasping here.
I would say. Well, how did free of it not click with you? You're free of the illusion of. It's funny because I'm just gonna keep saying the same words over and over and hope that this has the same meaning to Gingy that it has to me. But being free of the illusion of the self, right. Being free of the ego, like clear that the shadow on the cave wall is not reality. Okay, that's
to assume that once that line is drawn, like why I think they use the word that I'm blocking out of my brain right now, is because it's a constant practice of maintaining. Well, it's that line of that distinction can be drawn, and like, yes, now I know I'm free.
But it's not that, and that's why I say it's such a shitty translation, because you're using those faculties you should be free of to do that, right? So that it's almost like the opposite, you know. In fact, I mean, I guess it depends on how you want to define concentration, but let's just take a dictionary definition of it. Yeah, no, it's not adequate. It does not cut the mustard here. It is wholly insufficient for what this.
So what does being free of that mean?
That's the word, samadhi.
But to be free of.
Okay, here's the thing. There is no English translation for this. And I mean, many of these words, there are no direct English translations. And that's why I like to start with the Sanskrit, so that we can work into an English translation, because a lot of times to get close to a translation, it really takes creating a context and then kind of placing concepts and ideas inside this context in order to convey this word, and
Right.
the meaning of it. So yeah, don't try to, don't search your brain for the English word that I can put here. No, it doesn't exist. There is no word for it. So that's why what I'm trying to do is create a context and place within it concepts and ideas that are together convey the meaning
Right.
of this word, samadhi.
The reason I asked that is because an idea pops into my mind when thinking about this, that to be free of the illusion is one thing, and then
How about to transcend? To
like
transcend
to maintain
the
the
illusion.
and still that feels blurry, or I don't necessarily know what that means, to be free of it or to transcend it. In my mind, the closest thing I can rationalize, and this is like using ego to do this, is to maintain the distinction between the two.
No.
So, okay, see, again, I'm like, shit.
Yeah, it's I see what you're doing, and what you're doing is it's a practice of that thing that you're free of. So you're attempting to do something with something that can't be done. For instance, let's have a conversation about consciousness. Can't be done. And it's the turning the camera on the monitor. If you turn the camera on the monitor, you just get crazy feedback. You don't get anything. You don't get a clear image or concept or anything else. And that's what you're attempting to do. You're attempting to take the thing that you must completely eliminate to give us some adequate image or picture of what it is we're talking about here. And it's something that's free of images and objects and interpretations. And
just like in how people identify themselves in, I am my body, I am my thoughts, I am my mind, I am my personality, I am my job, I am my relationship, whatever it is.
Right. All of that is illusory.
Holding that distinction.
No, stop saying holding. Stop saying maintaining. Stop saying holding.
Hear me out. I'm trying to explain why I'm using those words. Because in maintaining that distinction, I'm like, all of those things that I could identify myself with are not the truth of the matter. They're just other things I could identify with.
Okay.
To a certain level.
So if I say so let's take the idea presented there and eliminate all the language of it and elevate it to a state. You're getting close.
Like a state of being.
Yes. Okay. Or a state of consciousness would probably be more accurate.
It's hard to comprehend.
It is. It is. And I mean, I get that.
Purposely,
this is why,
like that's the point.
It kind of is. It's almost, it's funny when you get into some of the Eastern traditions, and which is really where we're at now, because now we've gotten to the fourth of the Noble Truths. We've gone through all 8 of the Noble Path, and now we're at the 4th Noble Truth, and that's Nirvana.
So what would you define as the 8th Noble Path?
It's Samadhi. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it in the Sanskrit word and get what you can from that out of what we've just had as a conversation. But I would say it's a transcendent state of consciousness. Transcendent state of consciousness. And in this context of the Eightfold Noble Path, it's practicing that, being in that state. So it's about transcending the illusory self. That's what it is. It's a practice of transcending the ego, transcending the illusory self. That's the general concept of this 8th step.
Okay.
And I would say and transcendental meditation, things like that are most often the practices employed for this particular step.
Okay, now it clicks for me.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to think, like, how do you go throughout your day
Yeah.
Like practicing samadhi.
No,
And really, that's why meditation is such a powerful practice within this, because it does offer the ability to practice the transcendence or
right.
the freedom of ego and all that stuff, because you can create that separation within and say none of that. It's
right. And the more you do that, the more you practice that,
the more it just is.
And the more effective you are with step 7, that waking mindfulness and presence, right? So it really, that samadhi, that 8th step, enhances and gives you more power with the other 7 steps. Okay, 4th, noble truth, nirvana.
I'm glad we hashed that one out, because now I finally feel like that.
Yeah.
Brought in meditation,
and it's again, it's one of those things you can't have a conversation. It's like
or fucking define. In the use of language.
Yeah, it's funny. You can get into the same thing with like Chan or Zen. We'll get into it someday, and we'll have a conversation just like this one, a conversation about something you can't really have a conversation about, and try to describe something that can't really be described.
Chocolate or vanilla.
Yeah. So the 4th, but it's actually, I don't know if I got the order right, but it makes more sense in a presentation to end here with the 4th noble truth, which is nirvana. And nirvana is the experience, right, of complete freedom, of complete a state of non-suffering, right? A state free of suffering. And typically, it's like in many, especially the Far Eastern traditions of these particular philosophies, they've adopted a concept known as satori, and satori is it's like a moment. It's like a momentary experience of nirvana, and primarily it's been adopted as a concept because I think many in the West look at, like, especially when they look at these Eastern traditions and doctrines, they look at it like, oh, that's the goal, is to get to nirvana, right? Right. And I mean, I've seen, nutballs walking around like, well, I'm there, I've achieved it, I'm in nirvana.
Or naming their sinners nirvana.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to get into it. That should be in my. I should do a woke satire show, and I can make fun of all these enlightened fools. But it's. I think it speaks more to a potentiality of freedom from suffering. Not that anyone would ever actually choose it. And I think that's how it's seen, especially in the Far East traditions, is that, like, they have like I said, the concept of satori, which is a moment of this complete separation from the illusory reality and a complete state of nirvana, but it's fleeting. It's not permanent, and it is not a state that you enter for any length of time. And I think, again, having a worldview steeped in Western traditions, we have a tendency to translate it as like, oh, that's heaven, right? So it's because in Western tradition, it's like, oh, well, you either burn in hell for eternity, or you are bored to death in heaven by, sitting around and playing stringed instruments, whatnot.
Blissed out for all of eternity.
Yeah, and so that's kind of how we have interpreted this nirvana, right? Is that it's this our equivalent of heaven. It's a heavenly state.
Dude, I just watched, I don't remember what episode it was, some kind of TV show last week, and this girl was like, I think I might try out being lesbian, and her sister was like, oh, you're going to go to hell. And she's like, good. All the cool people are in hell. And I was like, she's kind of got a point. Like,
yeah.
Hell's kind of making
there's
a
actually
comeback.
there's a song by the Streets, and yeah, you know my propensity and my music skills, so I'm gonna mutilate it here, but I'll give you a gist of what it is of the
Okay.
chorus, and he's all, I wanna go to hell for the company, or I want to go to heaven for the weather, hell for the company. So he wants to go to heaven for the weather because assumption is it's sunny and warm
Sunny
all
and
the time.
75.
Yeah, sunny and 75 all the time. But I want to go to hell for the company because that's where all the exciting, people who shunned all the religious, I guess, doctrines and rules, and that's where they ended up, right? So the parties are down in hell, the good weather's up in heaven, and he wanted the best of both worlds. So go to heaven for the weather, hell for the company. So, but it's, yeah. And again, this is superimposing. When we take our traditions and we superimpose them on Eastern traditions, we make that mistake. And it's not necessarily like where you end up if you're a good Buddhist, which is how most Westerners would interpret Buddhism, is like, oh, well, I just got to follow these 8 steps and then I'm going to end up on a lotus with Buddha and nirvana. You know what I mean?
Because I don't want to be in hell suffering.
Right. But they're superimposing that Western view of reality onto Eastern philosophies and traditions, which they don't match up because, for one, they're founded in completely different worldviews. So there is no reconciling those two views. So I would say in our conversation here, in speaking of the path to freedom, right? So we're not looking at like nirvana as freedom necessarily,
Right.
but the process that we've discussed up through now, the Eightfold Noble Path, really, we could see as the path to freedom, in that by being mindful and present and aware of the root intentions behind our actions and our words, and the worldviews and narratives and ideologies that drive our view of reality, that by entering in a state into a state of awareness and presence with those things, there's the capacity and the power with that, the suffering that you experience in the world. And so that can dramatically reduce and relieve those experiences of suffering and bring you into a state of, we could call it freedom, in that there is very limited amount of suffering. And whenever there is an experience that could be likened to suffering, having these practices at hand and being able to call upon them to, like, look at something, right? It's an opportunity to look at, where is the attachment here? And again, it's not, like I said, this isn't a list of commandments. And in fact, attachment and desire are something you don't really want to give up. I would say that, look at relationships. Now, I've been in relationships both ways. 99% of my relationships there's been some level of attachment. In the few relationships where I have been able to and been mindful of eliminating any attachment or expectation within the relationship, were the only relationships where there was no suffering. There was no experience of being wronged or doing wrong, or it was just, it was a very rewarding experience, in that there was an extraordinary amount of love, appreciation, gratitude, without jealousy or hatred or anger or betrayal, and like none of that was present at all within the relationship. And so I could look at that and say that it is very powerful to have a relationship without attachment. And yet I also have children. I have 3 children. And I love my attachment to my children. Does that make sense? Like I don't want to not be attached to them. I don't want to let go of my attachment to them. Knowing that, yes, suffering can come out of my attachment to my children. And in fact, it has.
But that's also where the deep emotional, like some people call it love.
Right.
That's where that type of emotion comes from too, when you're attached to the children. Right.
But again, it's also, there's nothing wrong with the other feelings that come out of that attachment.
Right.
See, I don't want to equate freedom here to the abolition of suffering. Okay? Remember, we said limit. To abolish it would be to turn yourself into some kind of automaton. Because without it, you don't have the opposite of it. You don't have joy without hurt. They just, we get back into the Tao here. They're balanced. They define each other.
Right.
You don't have ecstasy without pain and suffering. They define each other. If you eliminate all that stuff you think you don't want to feel, well, all the stuff you think you want to feel becomes non-feeling because there's nothing to distinguish it. You know what I mean? So it's just, there are people who are in a tremendous amount of suffering. People who are deeply depressed, like 90% of their life, they're always in a state of depression or anxiety. And that comes out of that view. Again, step 1 of the path of 8 could eliminate so much of that.
All of this.
Yeah, because if you think about it, anxiety typically is some way of viewing and interpreting a perceived future, because of course it hasn't even happened and it's not even necessarily gonna happen. And even if it does, is worrying or having anxiety about it changing it? No, it's only giving you that experience that you're having. And then depression is typically connected to view of the past. So your view, and like you said with your coaching client, that at one point you had in that discussion, she recognized the transformation of her relationship with a past event. So that eliminates depression, because you can now, in looking back at that event, there aren't those feelings and that experience of depression that comes up, which would have been coming up had she held on to that other view. So again, and that's why I don't even like to, again, nirvana ain't the goal, and abolition of suffering ain't the goal. But that process can have you limit the amount of suffering, and really limit it to the point of choice. Like, you can actually be very intentional in what you want to suffer about. I'm not always, but I like to. Like there are certain days where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be in my shit today, and be sad and be angry and I'm just in it, and I go in all the way, and I throw any eating healthy out the window. I'm gonna eat 2 pints of ice cream. I'm gonna eat a large pizza. I'm gonna drink some beers. I'm just to hell with it all. You know what I mean? And really, right. It's those moments where I really embrace the suffering that make the not suffering so awesome. If I were to completely eliminate all suffering in my life, there would really be no good. There would be no highlight to the life.
I like to think about it like this. If I were to always get what I wanted, mm-hmm. that would get old quick.
Yeah.
There would be no fun. There'd be no challenge. There'd be no up and down. There'd be no diversity.
Right.
Now, if I always got the amount of money that I needed, it wouldn't be even worth my time considering it or thinking about it or planning to accumulate more or saving or any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. The whole game goes out the window. And so I always keep in mind that whatever it is that I'm thirsting for, that's what makes the thing so sweet. That if my thirst is quenched, there's no fun there, there's no pleasure there, there's all that stuff that I'm really looking to be gratified with is gone.
Right.
Like, if I'm like, I just want to eat a pizza every single day, and I'm like, okay, perfect example. If I'm like craving cigarettes, and I'm like, okay, I wish I could smoke cigarettes every day in my life, which is a point I used to be at. And I'm like, I wish it was good for me. I would do it all day, every day. And then I went to like a party with, not a party, but like a camping weekend with my buddy, and I smoked an entire pack of cigarettes in one day. And I was like, the first time I'd ever done it in my life. Just because we were sitting in front of a camping fire.
How was your throat the next day?
It wasn't too bad.
Oh,
But
nice.
the joy of smoking those cigarettes was gone.
Right.
I was like, I'm not even enjoying these things anymore. I just
Right.
it's just part of what I do. And it's like the reason that I did want to smoke all day, every day was because I enjoyed it.
Right.
But when I was doing it all day, every day, I didn't enjoy it.
Right.
And so that's like the bittersweet, quenching of your thirst that happens if you were to actually get rid of all suffering.
Right.
And only be in bliss and pleasure all day, every day.
Right.
Like, that's actually what people take medications for on both sides of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I always feel this way and I want to change. Or I always feel this way, but I want to change. Or I never feel anything. I wish I could be on one side or the other. Then they take medication for it. Like, those are actual prescriptions that exist for people.
Yeah.
Because they're too happy all the time, or they're not happy enough all the time, or they never feel anything. That's a trip to me. So that's the thing I always try to frame these conversations with is, okay, so what happens if you always get what you want? Will you still want it? What happens if you're totally free? What happens if you're totally free from everything? Always.
Now, having said that, because I feel like that's a really important part of the conversation, bringing in that that it's not about the abolition of suffering, that this freedom is really, we are free to suffer as well. However, most people experience being enslaved by their state of depression, anxiety, suffering in many different ways. It is a conversation about freedom and the path to freedom. And taking into consideration the concepts and the principles that we have talked about, the practices that you could incorporate or embody, I feel like the next logical place to go to is what people typically, if you talk about freedom, right? What is a person thinking of, and how would they relate to that word within this reality, within their reality? So, and I think oftentimes people would look at circumstances and conditions outside of themselves. So, for instance, the society you live in. Typically, right, is here in America, right, we have this concept of being a free country, right? We have freedom of expression and other things like that. And many people feel that there's a lack of freedom within this country. And some people think there should be a lack of freedom in this country. So there's that. And then and looking at, okay, so how does everything we just talked about, how does that relate to the conversation of one's experience? And you spoke into this at the very beginning, was the experience of freedom, right? At least that's what I made up when you used that phrase, was there's the experience of freedom. Okay. And what I would equate that to is looking at outside circumstances and conditions, the events around me, as if they determine or dictate my freedom. And I would say in this conversation, what I hope gets across is that there's a much deeper level of freedom that can be experienced. Actually, if you look at the book by what's his name? Viktor Frankl, right? Where he talks about his experiences in concentration camp. And
those were powerful.
Yeah, and how he experienced, really, again, what I got from it was at some level, at a certain point, he experienced a deep level of freedom because he realized that he had freedom in how he interpreted, how he reacted to, how he engaged the world of the concentration camp. Right? And I feel like that's a profound conversation to have, in that it speaks into, for one, everything we've been talking to up until this, that you can dwell into a world of deep suffering, or you can elevate and transcend into a world of very little suffering, and a high level of appreciation, gratitude, and love, and acceptance, and compassion, and all of that, as opposed to resentment and anger and hatred and depression and anxiety and suffering. So if we look at the outside of the world as something that dictates our internal experience, and I feel this is, not that it's been talked about directly, but I feel like we've touched on this in many levels in previous shows that we've done, both in Beyond the Matrix and Do We Have Free Will? And even in the last one we did on World on Fire, I believe that in all of those we touch on this in some way, shape, or form. And I definitely believe it's an extraordinarily important or significant topic for the world we're in right now, the reality around us and what's happening. I believe that these are very powerful tools and a very powerful way of thinking and seeing the world, such that we can elevate and transcend any suffering that we may be experiencing because of what we make up about what's happening.
There's a couple of things that I feel like, bringing it full circle, the difference between having freedom and experiencing is key. And everything that we went through with Buddhism, I think, are amazing tools for experiencing. And experiencing freedom, I think a lot of people, at least that I've coached and that I've engaged with, they're not necessarily feeling victimized by circumstances and conditions. It's usually one circumstance or one condition that they're seeking to have freedom from. So like, if it's a job, or if it's poverty, or if it's relationships, or if it's whatever else, there's something that they're experiencing suffering around, and they're seeking to have freedom from that suffering.
And I would go, and what I would say is, the issue's never the issue, and you alleviate that one particular event and they get a brand new job, and guess what? The suffering continues. Because it's their thinking. It's their way of interpreting the world.
Because are they actually free from what they wanting freedom from? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are they experiencing freedom in relation to this thing? No.
No.
So
and
even
that's on,
if you completely
but that's on
cut
them.
That thing out.
Yeah. That's on them, not the event or
Exactly.
the circumstance or the condition. Yeah.
So for me, the whole conversation about freedom isn't whether or not we are free or how do we create more freedoms, but it's how do we experience the freedom that exists for us. Like right now, there's not a single person, well, I'm not going to say that. The majority of people on this planet are allowed to go as far as they want to in any direction that they want to. And in fact, there are tools set up to help them and assist them to go even further than they could, like, say, a car or, say, an airplane. Now, people will get upset and say, well, I'm not really free when I fly on an airplane because I've got to do TSA and, I can't bring my full tube of toothpaste and stuff. But like, dude, you are free to buy your own plane, get your own helicopter, to fly without all those mechanisms and go as far as you want to build a friggin' space machine and take off this planet. You're free to do any of that. Whether or not you know how, whether or not you have the immediate resources to make that happen is irrelevant. But nothing is stopping you from the ability to do that.
Right. And even people who find themselves in, let's say, the most tyrannical forms of government, like, let's say, communist China or maybe Venezuela or something like that, where you may actually find yourself in a totalitarian form of government where it seems that what you can and can't do is highly restricted based on the system itself. You really still have all those freedoms. You're very mindful of the consequences if you get caught, but you still have the freedoms. It was funny. There's a saying that the only thing you have to do, it's the only things you have to do is die and pay taxes. And I'm like, nah, like you don't really have to pay taxes. like there,
when do you have to die?
There may be consequences to not paying taxes, but you don't have to pay them, right? But
prove to me that I'm going to die, that I have to die.
Well, that's definition of death. I would say if we're going to define death as like at one point your body will no longer be animated, then yes, you will die.
Well, that's
based on
because you could say
it is presumption, but
has died.
Exactly. It's based on evidence. It is empirical. Everyone up until now has died. So there's a really good chance
we know about.
Yeah, there's a really good chance that it's going to happen to you.
Okay, I'll buy that.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to take the scientific approach on that one. I'm not going to get too deep philosophically on death right now. But there is always freedom. And like I said, we spoke about Viktor Frankl and his freedom that he experienced. And I'll say for myself, and this was profound for me when the realization hit me. I spent 40 months in federal prison, and at a certain point, and I'm convinced I'm not the only one who has this experience. In fact, I'm convinced it's the reason there's a institutionalized people who just keep going back to prison. But at a certain point, I experienced freedom like I've never experienced at any point in my life. In fact, I am extraordinarily grateful for that experience in my life because it gave me the opportunity to realize the level of freedom that I can have in the world. And it's funny that it happened while I was in prison. But I mean, if you really think about it, you're completely free of those obligations that make you feel like you're not free in the real world. You don't have any bills in prison. You're not worried about where your next meal is coming from. It's guaranteed. And your place, where your bed is guaranteed, and clothes are guaranteed. And so it's like, if you take all the survival needs, right? And this probably relates directly to your Maslow's pyramid as well. But if you take survival needs and you completely eliminate them, like you have absolutely no concern for them at that point.
Now what?
Because so often our experience of freedom is caught up in that rat race element, which is funny because remember I told you at the beginning that liberation in the Hindu traditions, moksha, was the liberation of samsara, which is the cyclical world. right? So it's the rat race. And so being forcefully taken out of the rat race for 40 months gave me a whole new perspective. It allowed me to experience life from a place where I've been like samsara has been taken. Well, to a certain degree. You know, yes, it is very cyclical in prison. It is definitely the same thing every day. But there is still an extraordinary amount of freedom, even in this rigid structure, you know, and the structure becomes no different than the rising and setting of the sun, right? Yes, that you could look at that. That's a cyclical part of life, right? The sun rises and the sun sets, but it's not impeding you in any way, right? I mean, nobody's like, well, if the damn sun just stayed up or never came up, like life would be so much better. No, it's a non-issue. It's like, yeah, it comes up, it goes down. And I mean, maybe in ancient times when, you know, if there wasn't a moon and there was no sun, like, you know, I could see stuff gets freaky and gets weird and gets difficult. But in this world where we have, you know, electricity and things like that, like the sun going down doesn't affect anything. I mean, plants kind of need it, but like, other than that, it's like, it in no way affects my rat race, really. And that's kind of like how the patterns, those repetitive structures in the prison, once the mental need of sustaining oneself is gone, once the fear of not sustaining oneself or not knowing or being able to provide or any of those things, once all the essential needs are completely eliminated from focus, because like I said, in the real world, that's a lot of times that's most people's primary focus is those survival elements. Yeah. So when you completely eliminate that, those other cyclical elements of prison are just like the sun rising and setting. It's like, okay, yeah, there's a pattern. Like, yeah, I can't get out of my cell to a certain time every day, and I have to be back in at a certain time every day, and I can only eat in between these periods in the day, and you know, like all of that's laid out. But it's like I said, it's not the same kind of samsara. You know what I mean? That rat race kind of.
Did you feel like there was a level of bandwidth that was now accessible to you, having that foundational level of needs met?
What do you mean by bandwidth? Exactly.
Like, were you freed up a little bit to work and focus on different aspects of your life? Like, you told me you read a lot of books while you were in there.
Yeah, but
you might not have been able to do that.
Here's the thing. I did read. I read probably more in that 40 months than I have in my entire life until now.
Collectively, right?
But here's the thing. I was committed because I'm a reader. I've read my entire life, and I'm a learner and a lifelong learner. So I'm always learning. I'm always reading. But during that time, I committed to not reading any nonfiction. Like
so
nothing, nothing scientific, nothing philosophical, nothing, no self-help or, you know, business gurus, none of that. That was all out the door. I wasn't going to touch them. It was all fiction. And yeah, I read a lot. And there's what's interesting is I found I have now a profound appreciation for fiction and how I've now discovered people who are conveying deep knowledge and philosophy through fictional work. And I was just like, man, why didn't I ever think about that? Like I've avoided fiction all these years, not realizing that that's probably the best place to convey some philosophical concepts and ideas is through a fictional story. Because I mean, God, have you ever tried reading Being and Time by Heidegger? Oh my God. But turn that into a book of fiction where you're just, the elements of it, the concepts of it are within a story that, you know, has your, archetypes and your story arcs and all these other things that it's like it can keep you engaged. Whereas
I feel like it's got a different context to it, where I don't have to even think about whether or not what this guy's saying in this book is true, or whether or not I should believe it. All of that weight's gone, and you're like, I can just enjoy this make-believe story and then make up what I want to when I'm finished.
Yeah.
Which really, if we read all like nonfiction books that way too, man, that would be a lot smarter.
Yeah. Like I said, I had, up until that point, not that I had never read fiction, I had, but it was a pretty low priority. Like I didn't engage in reading fiction. I would occasionally come across something that was interesting and decide to read. But during that whole time, it was like, and again, I think that probably contributed to that experience of freedom, in that up until that point, like I haven't thought about this much, as this is just coming up for me right now and as a realization, but it's probably that up until that point, I would have seen it as a waste of effort and time to read if I wasn't gaining something from it.
Like just to read for fun.
Right. Yeah. Like,
I've had that same experience.
Yeah. So that's probably what it was. Again, I haven't had a chance to really dive into that deep because it's just now coming up for me. But that may be why I just decided, to hell with nonfiction. I'm going fiction the whole way. I mean, I don't want to get into it, but I've read an enormous amount. Like I read entire works by prolific authors that I had never read before. Not one. I had never read one of their books, and read every book they had ever written. So yeah, it was. I probably read like 80 books or something. Like more than that.
You should have
probably
written
over
a book
100
while you were in there.
I could have, but it would have impeded on my whole freedom thing.
I got stuff to do now.
I got stuff to do. Yeah, it's like I had nothing to do.
Did you really have free reign of doing like whatever you wanted to do with your days, or was it like college where you had to accumulate a certain amount of credits?
Well, you had to avoid getting, like, rather than accumulating credits, you had to avoid getting bad marks. You know what I mean? Okay. Like you didn't need credits. You were going to get out. Like everyone is scheduled to get out at some point. But if you get these negative marks against you, you won't get out as soon as you could get out. Okay, so it's not so much about accumulating credits as avoiding negative marks.
But you didn't have to like a minimum participation in anything that they offered there?
Not really. Besides working, you had to work. You had to work. But again, it was like I was fortunate because the work I was doing was work I loved doing. So it wasn't even like work, and the fact that I didn't need anything from the work, I didn't need to pay my rent with it. I didn't need to buy food with it. I didn't need anything. So the work was just my love and appreciation for the work that I was doing. I was fortunate that I got to build. I got to do metalwork. I got to do fabrication, and I love metal fabrication. So it's like a no-brainer. Like, oh, sweet! I get to do what was once a hobby. I get to do every day. Awesome, unlimited resources. Like I got all the welders I need. Like every tool I could possibly want to build shit with. I had, and I had access to. So, yeah. That's awesome. And now, again, I guarantee you not everyone had that experience, because when you're forced to work, and not everyone gets to work on doing something they love. Most people don't love what they're doing there. You know what I mean?
But I do wonder how many people go to prison and find this level of freedom that you're talking about and return to prison because they don't see the freedoms outside of prison.
I'm telling you, that's my theory on institutionalization. Like dudes get out and they end up right back in. Like this place, like they get out in the free world and they're like, this place sucks. I
don't want to pay
back
bills.
In there. Yeah, I want back. Like
It
I would
kind of
say
makes me think about like there's a lot of arguments about how many people return back to prison and how bad that number is. And it reminds me of the same conversation around homelessness, because I wonder how many people that are in prison actually want to be there and prefer being there.
Mhm.
And I would almost like say it might even be similar to the amount of people that are homeless
Who
and
prefer
choose to be homeless.
Yeah.
Like there was one guy that my stepdad was like, "Hey man, I'm not gonna be at the apartment for a while. Here's a key. You can go stay there as long as you want." And the guy went there, showered. What's that?
I was calling my son.
I was like, the guy literally went there for one night and took a shower and then packed up his stuff and left. And the guy, my stepdad came back after like, I don't know, a couple weeks or something like that, to find like 40 other people living in his apartment and not his buddy. And he's like, "What the hell, man?" He's like, you think I would be homeless if I didn't want to be?" He's like, "I don't like having the responsibility of a house or payments or bills or like all the stuff it takes to fill a house, to make it comfortable." And there's like, it blew my mind in college, because I was like, you mean not all homeless people like don't want to be homeless? There are some people that choose to live and camp a minimalist lifestyle, and it blew my mind. And now I'm like, the prison system's the same way. There are some people that are there that don't want to be there, but there are also people that are there that want to be there. It changes my entire worldview on the prison system.
Yeah, and I actually experienced that firsthand with homeless people as well. Me and a group of 3 friends, or 4 of us, we went into like near the Garment District, downtown LA, and at this time, this was back in 2002, 2003, sometime around there. And at first, we were gonna do like, oh, let's go feed the homeless kind of thing, and we decided, well, first, let's go have conversations with the homeless. Like, let's connect with these people. You know what I mean? Like, because like when we really sat down and thought about it, we're like, what's really valuable? Like they eat, they get food. You know, and okay, what's one more meal? Not that we were gonna not feed them, but we were looking for a deeper kind of experience.
Right.
This was an exercise in a deeper kind of experience around the homeless situation, and so we decided we separated. Like, so we each went our separate ways, and our goal was to connect, to truly connect with, like, have deep conversations with as many homeless people as we could within, I think we gave ourselves like a 3 or 4 hour time limit, and then we were going to all meet up again and then talk about our experiences and stuff like that. So I go, and the funny thing is, like, I figured, okay, 4 hours, whatever it was, dude, I'm gonna talk to like 20, right? I talked to 2. And the one, it would have probably only been 1, but the first guy I talked to, he was busy. He was like, I gotta go get my hustle on. You know what I mean? Like, it's good talking to you.
I'm late for work.
Basically, yeah. He's like, look, I got to go hit this corner. Got to get into my game, so I'll talk to you later. But he was really nice. Like, didn't blow me off or anything, but he was, again, it was clear. He was like, I didn't really get to have a deep conversation with him because I only got to talk to him for maybe 20, 30 minutes. But what I did get in that 20, 30 minutes of conversation with him was that, like, yeah, he had family, and yeah, they had homes and things like that. Drugs was an issue for him. But I didn't sense, and it never came up in the conversation, there was no resentment for his family, or friends or anything else. He was just like, this is it. Like, this is what I got, and I'm cool with this, is kind of what I got from him. The next guy I talked to, dude, we talked the rest of the time. It was like 2.5, 3 hours or something. I talked to this guy. And what was interesting, because he was, my dad's family is from New Orleans. And he was from New Orleans. And so that was our first point of connection, was like, you know, the Creole Cajun traditions that I was familiar enough with that I could have a conversation with him on. But then again, as the conversation went on, and drugs may have been an issue with him, but he was not under the influence of any drugs at the time, at least not to the point of it being noticeable. You know what I mean? Like, he could carry on a conversation. He didn't have
he wasn't
any
belligerent or anything.
Yeah, no, and he didn't have any physical tics that would like indicate that he was, you know, jonesing for something or in need of something or anything else. But I mean, literally, it was just like two dudes sitting on this, like a concrete, it's kind of like a set of stairs, like a low set of stairs that had no railing or anything on it. Like, we were just kind of sitting on that. Okay, sure. I don't know. I don't know officially what a stoop is, but we sat there and we talked. And what became clear to me was that it was a choice for him, definitely. That he had no desire for life to be any different. He had no desire to be in a house. He had no real desire to be, you know, to have, because he had family and things like that he did not see. Like, these aren't, and I imagine that's probably common for a homeless person. You don't necessarily see or interact with family or friends. Like, yeah, you see and interact with people, mostly other homeless people, but there's a sense within him a need or a desire for any human connection beyond that, beyond what he was experiencing on the streets.
Right.
He actually, the funny thing is, he actually seemed more secure and less in need of approval than most regular people I meet. You know what I mean? Like, he was good. You know what I mean? He was just
like more emotionally mature.
Yeah, exactly. He was just in a good place. Like I would say that the stereotypes of what we get for homeless people and I'm not saying that these don't exist, but yet that, you know, it's a majority of, you know, drug users and mentally ill and things like that. Dude, he was neither that I could detect. Like I said, he may have been a drug user, but he wasn't drinking at the time. He didn't have drugs at the time. He didn't seem affected by drugs at the time. And he definitely didn't have any mental illness that I could detect. You know, like, he was like, we had a conversation, a real conversation. And so it definitely changed my worldview around homelessness as well. And that and what's funny is, when we all came back together, me and my three friends, that was the experience we all had. Like, nobody came across someone who was like, yeah, I got, you know, bad luck, blah, blah. Nobody was blaming anyone for anything. And everyone was pretty much in a place of choice of where they were. Now, it may be the area of Los Angeles we were in. These may be, you know, seasoned homeless people, you know, because I know that there are, that's a thing, you know, people who've been homeless for a long time. Like, people who lost their homes recently because of, you know, the market and end up in tents on, you know, under bridges. They're not seasoned homeless people. You know what I mean? So they don't necessarily have the same approach. Yeah, they're new to the game. And they're definitely not in a place of like, oh, yeah, this is cool. But these guys were. You know, these guys were seasoned homeless people, and they were for the most part, the ones that we could have conversations, because some of my buddies did run into some of the same situations where it's like, you couldn't have a conversation because the person was, you know, blasted out of their mind, or, you know, not coherent, or I didn't come across any, but my buddies, a couple of them did come across people who were clearly mentally ill. Like, they definitely shouldn't be on the streets. Like, describing the way these people were and how they were experiencing the world around them, like, they should be somewhere where they could be taken care of. So that there is definitely that, and we did have that experience, but I just happened to have the experience that I had.
Dude, the funny thing is those people probably are more taken care of with the people on the streets than they are or were with their family. Like, say, like there's been all of these like social experiments and stuff like that, but I have like I don't remember when, but like being a musician, touring musician, I've spent my fair share of nights outside of a club at 2 a.m. waiting for everybody to finish up and get paid. And there'll be a guy walks by, and there's one dude specifically I remember. Like we played 2 nights in a row, I think, in Denver at one point. And this dude walked up, I forget his name, but he was the guy that always walked around with the guitar on his back. Like every day you'd see him, he'd be like 1 string less. So he had 6 strings, and he had 5 strings and 4 strings. And he just came up and he was like, "Hey man, what's up? You got any change for me? I'll play a song or something." And just like ended up chatting with him. I'm like, "What happened to like the $20 that I saw you collect in 30 seconds that I saw you out here last night?" And he's like, "Oh man, I bought food for all my buddies. I went back and we all ate a bunch of pizza and we had a couple of beers and out of money again. So I'm just out here doing it again." And I was like, "You spent all the money that you got on you and your friends?" Like, "Yeah." It's like there's a group of us over here that just all hang out. And it's like they're like my family. Like I feel as though the homeless community is more of a community. I mean, this is a broad generalization, but I have seen immense connection and community relationships inside homeless communities as well. And it's not like there's just lone zombies that are sick and drugged up wandering the streets. Everybody wants to like kick out of their neighborhoods. These are like people that are compassionate and amazing individuals that are on the street too. And the thing that full circles this for me is that a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have found a level of freedom that works for them in choosing homelessness.
Yeah. I get it. I definitely get it now. Like it rings true, and I can relate. I can see how there would be an experience of freedom around it. So looking, and again, steering this back to why I brought this part into the conversation was that often we look outside of ourselves as what causes us to experience freedom or not. And from my experience, that's not necessarily. Like now, somebody may be sitting there and go, "Well, you're in prison. You weren't free." And again, I would say, "Well, what's your definition?" Because I absolutely felt a freedom that I've never experienced before. And you may not know what freedom is and what it feels like to truly be free, especially if you're caught up in, gaining approval, being accepted, being right, looking good. Like if you're caught up in all that, you're not experiencing freedom at any level.
You could be.
No, you're not.
I think you could choose to create an experience of freedom in that, but whether or not you're really free, or whether or not that's a constant experience.
Yeah, it doesn't fall under my definition of freedom.
I think realistically, people can create the experience of freedom regardless of what the circumstances and conditions are.
No, they can
going over the Buddhist
here I'm gonna rebut you and say they could create the illusion of freedom. Like, let's take the wealthiest people on the planet, right? Because oftentimes that's what people see as the source of freedom is money, right? If I had all the money in the world, I'd be free because I could go anywhere and I could do anything. These people typically, I can't even paint broad strokes with the wealthy and the elite, but I'm gonna generalize. I'm gonna say typically the wealthiest people on the planet are some of the most depressed, most anxious, right? Because they are caught up in the need to be right, the need to look good, the need for approval from others. Okay, they still are caught up in that game. And all the money in the world can't buy you out of that game. And if you're caught up in that game, there's no freedom because you're still you're suffering, but not from a place of choice. Like I said, when you get the process of transcending suffering, then you can be in a place of choosing how and when you experience suffering, right? They're not there. And all the money in the world can't buy their way to that place. All the money in the world ain't going to buy you nirvana. Ain't going to buy you satori. Ain't going to buy you samadhi, right? It just doesn't happen like that. And typically what you find is people who accumulate vast fortunes actually get more caught up in that shit. They get more caught up in their ego. They get more, it actually becomes worse. How often have you heard somebody say, more money, more problems, right? There's a freaking song with that title, right? So
yeah, dude.
Yeah, so it's clear that like people who've been on both sides, like even Joe Rogan would say, shit just got crazy when I had a lot of money, it becomes more of a burden. Having if most people would say that having an extraordinary amount of money becomes a much bigger burden. And I can relate, because when I was in prison, I didn't have any money. I experienced freedom, right? So I get it. I can see.
24 cents a day.
No, hey man, I got up to the highest pay scale. I was making at one point, I was making like 75 cents a day or $1. I might have got up to $1 a day. Yeah, $1 a day. That's the highest.
Pay you something.
That's the highest end of the pay scale. The lowest end was, no. I'm sorry. That's not per day. That's per hour. That's the highest end of the pay scale per hour. Okay, so 70. It was either 75
I was
cents.
Gonna say like a bag of nuts is like a week's worth of work.
No. That's not right. But here's the thing: most people are at the lowest end of the pay scale, which was 13 cents an hour. 13 cents an hour. Dude, imagine that. Nothing. Imagine working for 13 cents an hour.
100 years ago, maybe.
I don't know, man. Yeah, when you could actually go to the movies for 13 cents.
Yeah. I remember filling up my tank for a nickel. I like those days. I see what you mean though about more money, more problems.
Yeah.
Because really, it's not like money is not going to buy freedom.
No.
There are certain things you could experience freedom from, but really the being free, there's a whole lot more responsibility that comes with higher levels of income. Mm-hmm. And like you were talking about. But there's still the option and the ability to experience freedom with or without money. With Absolutely. Or without any other circumstance.
Yeah, so it's not to say...
That's the point I'd like to really drive in here for everybody.
Yeah, and it's not to say that because you have a lot of money, you won't experience freedom. No, absolutely. You regardless of the money, if you've got all of it or none of it, you can experience freedom. And because the money it's not a factor. It's really, exactly. it's, I mean, I guess for one, it'd have to be on your access to technology that can alleviate or elevate you to a state of consciousness where you experience freedom. So I guess that's one thing that would
technology?
Help. Did you hear what I said by technology? Did you hear what came after technology, Gingy?
Yes, I did hear that.
Okay, because I wasn't talking about computers and iPads.
Okay.
But yes, that would definitely be. Had I not, let's say, if you didn't have some kind of spiritual tradition, because that's often where people will find this pathway to freedom is in some philosophy, some spiritual tradition. That's where that's the technology I'm talking about. Without that, it could be difficult because then you're left to your own devices. What capacity do you have to think in a way that first to realize that you do have that power, within your experience to transform it. And then
everybody always has that power.
Right.
Any moment.
But it's like, okay, part of it is having an awareness that you have that power, right? Like that doesn't, that may just occur to you one day, or it may not. And I'd say that's probably a pretty significant part of this, is whether or not you've ever been exposed to something that could be a pathway to freedom. And there are many pathways to freedom. I feel, like I said, I focused on what I focused on today because I feel like it's just such a simple one. It's so easy. Because
really, you don't even need the whole list. You don't need all 4. You don't even need all 8 in number 3. We talked about you could really get away with 1 or 2 or even 3 of them. Yeah. Be incredibly successful in experiencing freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And
I know people that have made up their own processes to be like, no, I don't care about any of that. This is what works for me.
Well, dude, look at every, this is funny. Look at every profound self-help book out there, right? Whether it's your 7 spiritual laws of success or your, what does Don Miguel Ruiz call his? The 4 agreements, whatever, right? It's
the 7 steps to wokeness.
Whatever, right? There's the 11 principles of this and the 12 steps of that, and it's all the same shit. You know what I mean? Like in reality, sometimes it's exactly the same shit, just like giving different words. Yeah, it's like, well, we'll change the vernacular around, change the syntax a little bit, and the vocabulary tweaked here and there, and then it's like it's something new, something different, but it's like it's the same stuff, and there's a reason why it occurs to people to be so profound. Wow, why it occurs to people to be so profound is that it does have that spark of something else, that truth that kind of supersedes and has made its way into all traditions, right? Like I said,
an underlying body of information or of knowledge that has somehow been interpreted in different ways throughout time. And that's something that we've talked about in the past. I'd really love to find like what those original teachings say. I like getting to the common
fucking Ginger. You always think there's a thing that the start, the point, the focus, the concentration.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, dude. There is no the original, that what you're stuck in is linear. Like you're assuming that it's linear, that it all came from a point. What if it's not, Gingy? What if reality, what if the universe isn't linear, Gingy? What if it's cyclical? What if there is no beginning and end? What if it's something that's always been present?
That's fine too.
Okay.
In fact, that's the way that I lean. However, we're talking about all these different things communicating the same message, and I'm like, I'd like to get in there and find all the commonalities.
But if you think about it, it even actually makes more sense that this is something that is beyond a linear progression. It is something that is part of the nature of reality and why it has appeared in everything, as opposed to like, oh, well, it was those guys back there. They're the ones who figured it out and we've all inherited it from them. There are cultures on this planet who have never had connections to each other up until the present last couple centuries. And yet the concepts, the principles, the traditions, especially these most profound ones, were already there. And there was no connection ever in the past or anything else. And the presumption and assumption is that it must have come from some people or some writing or some doctrine or some teaching. But what if it is underlying reality. These are principles by which reality unfolds, and then we just kind of tap into them as opposed to pass them along and trade them off and inherit them from other cultures or traditions or anything else. To me, it almost makes more sense, because then you can't, because then it can occur all over the planet without necessarily all these different people on the planet ever having a connection to each other.
Now, realistically, all of this stuff exists in the psyche or the consciousness of the race, what some people will call collective consciousness.
Right. And that's
I'm less interested in where it came from or who invented it or its origin. And I'm more interested in seeing all the commonalities, seeing all the same things that people have pulled out. That's cool to me.
That's actually what led me down my path of learning, literally researching, learning every religion, every philosophy, anything and everything I can get my hands on, because it was that finding a common thread that I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Because at first, because I started when I was pretty young, and I was like, I had a spiritual need within me. So my first, being of Western culture, raised by Western culture, my belief was that there must be a right religion, right? And I was clear that it wasn't mine at the time, which was Catholicism. So I'm like, okay, well, that one ain't right. Whatever, that can't be the one. So I went searching, and in researching with an open mind, because I was in a place of like, well, I know that one ain't right, but one of them might be, and so I just started just absorbing every religion and philosophy I could. And then just finding that, like, wow, there's a lot more here that's the same than that's different. Yeah. And when you look at the stuff that is different, it's the stuff that's non-consequential. It's like it's meaningless, really, as a spiritual tradition and the true principles of these doctrines. Like, you get rid of the dogmatic stuff, and it's like, okay, these are pretty much all the same. Like if you like in the Hindu system, there is reincarnation, right? And in modern Christianity, that's not a thing, right? It's life and then eternal damnation or eternal heaven, right? So but I'm saying those are dogmatic, because in this life, it is immaterial and irrelevant if either of those is right, right? Like, if the principles to live your life by are the same, then I could just be Hindu. And if it is eternal damnation, well, then I'm going to heaven because I live my life by these principles. Now, I know a lot of Christians don't buy that, because they're like, no, you must acknowledge Jesus Christ as the one and only, which is funny because Hindus, by their nature and by the nature of their religion and their culture, like, their worldview of the Brahman being manifest in all, and the Atman, the individualization of the Brahman, which is what we would call God, right? And the Atman being like that individual piece of God. So in their culture, like, to say you're God is like a no-duh kind of like thing. So when the Christian missionaries went into India, they were surprised at how accepting of Christianity they were. Like, oh yeah, he's God, cool, yeah, right on, yeah, we believe it, because they're like, yeah, we got this elephant-headed one over here rides around on a mouse. We got this one over here with 10 arms. Yeah, they're all sons of God and the one God and blah blah blah. And they didn't run into any problems until they're like, no, this is the only one. All yours are wrong. And they're like, what? What do you mean? Like, he's the only one. We're all one. Like, their worldview was like
it's literally 100 to 1, and you guys want us to pick your side.
Yeah, and all of a sudden it didn't make sense, because their worldview was the Brahman manifests in every individual. So every individual is God, playing that he's not, and these people who show up as like avatars and like demigods or heroes or whatever within the historical context of our societies and our religious stories and things, they were the ones who just kind of excelled. You know, they showed up with as the manifestation of the word of God, of the power of God, you know, and all that. So yeah, they were clear, like not everyone shows up like Shiva, but Shiva's no better than I. You know, like we're both the Atman, we're both
not a
of the Brahman. Yeah, it's just like he came here to do his thing. I'm here doing my thing. You know, there's not a right or wrong to who's here doing their thing. And so when you come to me with this, oh, there's this new character, his name's Jesus. Okay, yeah, cool, yeah, add him to the stack. You know, put his little statue up there next to the other ones. And they're like, no, he's the only one. And that they're like, wait, what? No, he's not. You guys don't get it. You know, so that was where the conflict came in. They had no problem accepting Jesus, accepting Christianity. They had no problem until the Christians wanted to turn around and go, no, you have to stop believing in all the other things you believe and acknowledge that none of those things were God. You know, and they're like, that doesn't make sense to a Hindu. Like, because again, their worldview, what they came out of is that like the Brahman is the ultimate and manifests in everything. So yeah, of course he's Jesus, and of course he's Shiva, but of course he's me too, you know. So it just didn't jive with a long-seated worldview. Like in reality, that the Hindu culture, because it's more than a religion, it's a culture, it's a language, it's all that. It's probably one of the longest standing traditions and cultures on the planet. Like the oldest texts on the planet come out of their culture, you know, and that's an interesting conversation for another time if you look at the nature of those texts and what they're talking about, these 10,000-year-old books. But when our narrative of history does not fit with their idea of their own history. Like they look at it as like, nah, this has been going on for tens of thousands of years. Like that's how they look at their own past, you know, like, oh yeah, there was, you know, this city over here that's, you know, now underwater, whatever. Yeah, that was, you know, tens of thousands of years. We're like, no. There were only cavemen tens of thousands of years ago. Like, nah, we had cities. You guys may have been cavemen. We had cities, you know.
You guys were in the caves. That's
yeah,
fine.
you guys might have been in caves. That's cool. Like we're not going to judge, but we had a city. It was a big city, you know.
That's awesome.
So I know we didn't get a chance. Yeah, we're going to have to leave that for another time, which is actually probably good because it doesn't exactly fit with this, but I did want to touch on responsibility. But I feel like in the direction that we took this conversation on freedom, that it's better left for another conversation because it would fit more with the conversation. I feel like
it's actually interwoven into everything that we addressed, and I feel it's a big takeaway from this entire conversation.
Yes, it is.
Freedom is not given. Freedom is
generated.
Yeah. Generated.
Yeah.
Freedom is generated and experienced by the individual. And
right.
Even in nirvana, enlightenment, all of that stuff, they're still going through the day-to-day doing the same things with a different experience. Even in healing a old trauma or whatever that's happened, there's just a shift of your relationship with that thing, that event, person, that whatever. So the shift is internal and the experience is generated within. That to me is like fundamentally what we've talked about this entire call. Well, majority of the call. The whole experience of freedom lies there. So if not responsibility, then I don't really know where freedom would come from.
Right.
Now liberty, that would be different. Like somebody else can give me liberty. Like move the fence. Now I can walk further. Thank you.
Right.
That's different.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because it's different based on the distinction, the definition that you're giving liberty, but it is in some traditions and cultures, that's how it's translated into English is a liberation, which
actually, that's something I wanted to bring up with you.
I would say, I would make the similar distinction to the way you distinguish it, as liberty is something that is outside of, but that's not how they mean it, even though it's translated that way. Again, right. there's a lot of
how it's
poor
used
translation.
More than anything else.
Yeah, and there's a lot of poor translation of especially of Sanskrit into English, in my opinion. Of course, I'm no expert. But.
Let me read this to you, because after I had given that distinction, the difference between liberty and freedom, I was reading the middle way. It says the middle way or middle path is the term that Gautama Buddha used to describe the character of the noble eightfold path he discovered that leads to liberation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, it's using that word. And again, that's right. Coming from moksha, which is the Hindu. You got to remember, Buddhism really came out of Hinduism. I mean, Buddha, Gautama, would have been of the Hindu people, of the Hindu traditions, of the Hindu culture. In fact, he was a Hindu ascetic. So they are heavily entwined. And again, I would translate it differently because of my personal how I personally define that word of liberty and liberation.
And the contemporary use of the language.
Yeah. So that's why a lot of times when I speak on many Eastern philosophies, I'll even use Chinese words, because I like to go back to where the word originated. Like when we have conversations about Zen, and taking Zen from the Japanese back to the Chinese of Chan, and taking that back to the Sanskrit of Jnana, and then really then trying to work it from there, as opposed to just this is because typically I don't know who came up with it. At what point, who decided this was the word for that word? But I don't think that they've always done such a great job. You know what I mean? I feel like sometimes their efforts have been half-assed at best. So I don't completely agree. And the only reason I can even speak intelligently on something like translation, because I'm no linguistic expert or anything, but I look at it as from a context. Like if you look at the context of the Eightfold Noble Path and the Fourfold Noble Truth, and even like the root words, what, like all the ways we could translate those words. Like when you put a context with it, it's like, yeah, I get it. Yes, that word could be right, but in this context, it seems more appropriate to translate it as this. It's funny because it's actually difficult for us to conceive there not being word for word translations from every language to every language, and it's just not the case. It's always contextual. Like to translate something verbatim is often a horrible mutilization. Mutilization, is that a word?
Mutality.
a horrible mutilization of the
mutilation.
Word. Mutilation, there it is. A horrible or grotesque mutilation of the phrase because it is void of the context. Like, I mean, even from languages that are closely related, like Latin-based languages to English, like we have a lot of Latin-based words in the English language. And so it's not much of a leap to translate into a Latin-based language, like let's say Spanish. But if you do a verbatim, word-for-word translation of an English phrase into Spanish, it seldom holds the same meaning. In fact,
doesn't work.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of times can completely distort the meaning. So that's why I think it's a good idea.
And it shows like the mindset of the people that use the language and the people that created the language. Where like, even though in Spanish you could say like, ¿Qué es tu nombre? Like, what is your
number?
No.
So that's what it is. What is your number?
But that's not what they say. That's not what they use. Because the people will say like, ¿Cómo te llamo? And that's like, how are you called?
Called.
Verbatim. But you wouldn't hear somebody in English be like, hey man, how are you called? Doesn't happen.
Softly, loudly, when it's...
So it just shows like the approach to the language too, which I think is cool.
Yeah, no, it's and that's why I feel like, especially when you're talking about a philosophy that was born in another tradition, in another language, that it's important to like really get at the root of the language and really kind of work it up from there as well. So I try to do that as much as I can. Oftentimes I definitely don't have the exposure to, like, say, Hebrew, as I do to, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and even Chinese. I have I've delved deeper into those languages, whereas there's definitely some of the Hebrew writings and traditions that I feel like I could definitely gain by doing some research in the language. It just hasn't become part of my repertoire as of yet. I haven't delved into it, but I know if I ever were to dive deep into some Western traditions, that I feel that having a firm grasp on Hebrew would be hugely beneficial. Because I've seen, just in the small parts I have seen, when I have seen people say, well, this is how these are the possible translations of these words from this text and how it appears over in this text. Wow. Like, I feel like a lot was lost there. Like, wait a minute, you took 15 different words from this text and translated them as the same word over here? Like, I feel like you could have created some nuance or some subtle changes there,
Dude, but there's even like translations of translations. Yeah. Like they'll translate into English, but then 500 years will go by and they'll be like, well, we don't really use those words the way that we used to, so we're going to translate that English text into this new contemporary version of English text. Mm-hmm. And that could be even further from the original interpretation.
And then consider that that's happening in every language. That's right. Like, it was funny when I was a kid, there's this place, like it's a pretty big office complex kind of thing, right? It's a facility, right? And it's like the sign. This is right on Beach Boulevard in Huntington Beach, right? Like a major street, like a pretty big facility. It's all Bible translators. I'm like, what? And this is in the 80s. I'm like,
I want that job.
I'm like, wait a minute. You guys ain't done doing that? Like, hasn't that already been done? Like, how are you still translating the Bible? I'm like, it was this head scratcher. Like, wow. Like, I mean, I realize there's a lot of languages and stuff in the world, but I'm like, we've had this book.
You ever watch that movie, The Man from Earth?
Man from Earth.
Dude,
it's like a B movie, right? And he's like 10,000-year-old dude. Yes, I have seen
it. I'm like, I could just see the biblical translations getting smaller and smaller and smaller, just like how that guy was like, oh, I could tell you the entire Bible in 10 words. Don't. I was like, okay, that's the ultimate translation for him anyway. Right. There's a lot lost in that translation.
Right. But I guess what I realized as I got older was that, like, actually that is something that would be going on indefinitely, is the translation of the Bible, because the nuances in language are constantly changing in every language. Yeah. And I'm sure they've put that book out in every language, Yeah. I'd be amazed if it wasn't in at least 80 languages. I wouldn't be surprised if it was more, but I would be surprised if it was less. I would be
surprised if it wasn't. I feel like they have put that language the Bible into just about everything.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I'm sure that there are some languages that still Christianity has not reached the culture, the cultures that speak those languages.
Right.
But Like, anyway. I know, for instance, you can go to like Zambia and they speak 40 different languages inside that country.
Right.
And there's a huge Christian presence there. And I'm like, I wonder if they took this book and put it into all 40 of the languages. Or because
or
they
did they
all
just
have a
get
common language
or
of
did,
English.
or did they just get lazy, put it into one of them, and then like start doing what they did, what the Spanish did, like in the Americas, and they're just forcing everyone to adopt that language.
Yeah, actually, they speak 40 languages, but one of them's English, and that's the one that they use between tribes.
Right. Yeah. English for English. Okay.
Thinking about that, I was like, "Oh shit, okay."
All right. I feel like we beat this one dead.
We nailed it, man.
Yes. All righty. Well, thank you very much, Gingy, for a very stimulating conversation. I look forward to our next one. And thank everybody for joining us. And talk to you very soon.
Yeah.
Phenomenosophy, episode 5.
Phenomenama.
Path of Freedom. Path to Freedom. Bye, y'all.
Freedom. That's a buckle 5.